Welcome everybody. Today we have the Director of the Cayman Islands Financial Reporting Authority, RJ Berry, with us. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Patrick. Pleasure to be here.
Director of the Financial Reporting Authority since 2016. Prior to that, he was Head of Compliance at the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, or CIMA, for 12 years, and has also served as Deputy Head for 2 years. Mr. Berry was also 9 years of private banking experience and investment dealing experience, having worked at CIBC and Trust Company Cayman Limited, Barclays Bank and Trust Company, and Bank Vontable Cayman prior to joining CIMA. Mr. Berry has a Bachelor of Business Administration and is a certified anti-money laundering specialist. He also holds the Canadian Security Certificate in Series 7 equivalency. And Mr. Berry was awarded the Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, or an OBE, in 2024 for services to UK sanctions regime and the global financial standards in the Cayman Islands. That's a very impressive resume, so do appreciate. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. So let's start with the basics, RJ. What is the FRA?
Sure, Patrick. The FRA is the Financial Intelligence Unit for the Cayman Islands. It originally started off as a unit within the RCIP, so the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service, back in the 80s. And then in the early 2000s, it underwent a change and became the Financial Reporting Unit. And then later on became the FRA and became a civilian-staffed administrative-style FIU. So it separated from being a part of law enforcement and became an administrative FIU. And then the investigative mandate now sits with the law enforcement agencies in the Cayman Islands.
Okay. And so then today, what are the actual main functions of the FRA?
The FRA has two main functions. It has what I call the core FIU function of receiving, analyzing, requesting, and disseminating information related to proceeds of crime or suspected proceeds of crime. So that's typically filed through suspicious activity reports to the FRA. We then analyze them and determine what to do with them, and then decide whether to disseminate them to relevant parties. The second major function of the FRA, back in 2017, we were designated to be responsible for the implementation of targeted financial sanctions that are in force in the Cayman Islands as extended by the UK, specifically for at the time the four regimes that were part of the FATF methodology for terrorist financing and proliferation financing on the recommendations 6 and 7.
In terms of your structure and reporting channels, where does the FRA sort of fit within the current Cayman Islands regime, and who do you report to?
Sure. The FRA is a department within the Portfolio of Legal Affairs, or POLA. POLA is headed up by the Honourable Attorney General. The chief officer for POLA is the Solicitor General, Ms. Reshma Sharma. So I report directly to the SG.
So you mentioned previously just the scope of the remit and your day-to-day sort of functions. Just in terms then of the types of reports that you receive, can you describe those, and sort of who predominantly do you receive these reports from?
Sure. Predominantly we receive SARs, and they come from persons and entities. Typically they're financial service providers, but essentially the SAR reporting obligation, which we'll talk about a little later, any person can file a SAR, but it typically is going to come from entities doing relevant financial business, so typically financial institutions or DNFBPs. We also receive requests or spontaneous disclosures from overseas FIUs. The FRA is a member of the Egmont Group, so the Egmont Group plays a key role in facilitating cooperation between FIUs internationally. Sticking in the sort of AML, CFT, CFP context, we also have implemented threshold reporting for money services businesses and banks.
Right.
So there are prescribed regulations for the MSBs. They have to file quarterly reports pursuant to the Anti-Money Laundering Money Services Business Threshold Reporting Regulations 2020. And then the banks under the Anti-Money Laundering Class A and Class B Bank Threshold Reporting Regulations 2022. So those threshold reports came into play.
Right, so it's quite a wide remit then, in terms of reporting that you are receiving. I guess just to drill down on that point, Are you able then just to elaborate a bit more? I think most listeners are probably familiar with, in theory, what a SAR report is, but I guess if you're able to differentiate between those AML reports and sort of the SARs versus sanctions reports.
I think the way I usually look at it is most of the AML, CFT, CFP reporting obligations are on the POCA in terms of if you have suspicion of criminal conduct. So if you suspect criminal conduct, your reporting obligation is a SAR, simply put. Under the sanctions regimes, there are reporting obligations there. Now, you see, compliance reporting forms is typically what we refer to as the reports that come in under the sanctions regimes. And there, the reporting obligations are set out in the applicable overseas orders in council that have been extended. So the reporting regimes are very separate. The reporting on the sanctions has nothing to do with POCA. It has to do with your obligations under the specific regime in place. So, for example, I've had quite a bit of compliance reporting forms related to the Russia sanctions regime.
Exactly. We've seen that in the last 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. So the reporting obligations, you have to report if you know or suspect you're dealing with a designated person, if you're reporting frozen assets, and lastly, there's also self-reporting if you suspect you've breached sanctions or if you suspect that someone else has breached sanctions. Those are the 3 main categories that are usually reported on the compliance reporting form. Every now and then you get a sort of a crossover where someone files a CRF and a SAR, because in the course of looking at their reporting obligations under either, particularly under the CRF, they may also be aware of other information that gives rise to suspicion of criminal conduct, so they file a SAR as well.
Wow.
What I like to stress is one doesn't substitute for the other. So if you need to file a SAR, file a SAR. If you need to file a compliance reporting form, file the compliance reporting form, because the SAR doesn't cover the reporting obligation under the sanctions regime or vice versa.
That makes sense. And you sort of mentioned there that typically the filers might be financial institutions, but is it just limited to financial institutions, or the obligations extend to every person in Cayman for both sort of regimes?
Yeah, when you look at 136, it does say any person or person. Section 137 is specifically with regard to nominated officers, which we commonly refer to as money laundering reporting officers or MLROs. So theoretically, any person can file a SAR.
So I guess it's a relevant question now in that context, particularly if you are just an individual and a foreign person as well. Like, how do you physically file the SARs? Is there a designated email, website address to make the filings?
We introduced electronic filing of SARs through a portal, I believe in 2020. It's the AM Live portal. So what we set about doing was we looked back at SAR filers over the last 2 years, and anyone who had filed a certain number of SARs, we approached them because we have to issue a license for you to have access to AM Live. So we registered a number of people, what we call the large SAR filers. And then since then we've been adding people. I don't have the stats with me now, but I think we've got over 400 users for AM Live, and I would say about 70% of SARs coming through AM Live. If you don't have a license for AM Live, then you send it via email to Financial Reporting Authority at gov.ky.
And so once somebody's either submitted through the AML Live reporting portal or emailed the FRA, then generally what is the process? Do you respond proactively to them, or does it sort of go?
Sure. Every SAR gets assessed. So we currently have a priority system of 1 to 5, where 1's the top priority. Priority 5s are we file it as intelligence without doing any further analysis on it. So we then, each priority has a time frame that we try to turn it around in. And then it's assigned to an analyst to do their analysis. So SAR filers are going to get an acknowledgement. They may also get a directive from us. We're authorized to issue Section 42C directives to request further information to either amplify the information we have. So we can issue a directive to the SAR filer or to any third party that we believe has relevant information for us to amplify our analysis. Or we might be requesting information to respond to a request from an overseas FIU.
Wow.
So when we issue our directive, we don't say which one it is, because obviously requests from overseas FIUs are confidential, and they do not want parties to know
exactly
what they're doing. So we just say, pursuant to Section 42C, we're directing you to produce the following information, and people won't know whether it's to amplify a SAR or to respond to an overseas FIU.
Right, that makes sense. And you mentioned before, I think in the example, you said that you would also receive the SAR and then report back maybe to foreign FIUs and to local departments. So is there kind of a typical priority or list of who, once you've received the SAR, the information, who you then actually report that to, domestically as well?
Yeah, we have very broad provisions under POCA. So under Section 138, if we have suspicion of criminal conduct, it says we shall, which is mandatory, we shall disclose to local law enforcement. And then it says we may disclose to SEMA and other competent authorities with AML CFT responsibilities. And I forget the exact wording, but anyone who has an AML CFT role in the Cayman Islands we can disclose to. And then the third part is about we may disclose to an overseas FIU. So typically what will happen is, again, once it comes in, it's assigned, the analysis is undertaken. If after the analysis we don't think we haven't satisfied ourselves that we have suspicion of criminal conduct, we can file that as no further action. We'll send a closure letter to the SAR filer advising them that we close it, no further action. For SARs that we then analyze and amplify the information and arrive at suspicion of criminal conduct, we would disclose to all relevant parties. So typically, the Cayman Islands Bureau of Financial Investigation within RCIPs is the primary party that receives disclosures from us, but we also make disclosures to the Anti-Corruption Commission. So, for example, if the subject matter of the SAR is indicative of a corruption offence in the Cayman Islands, that would go to the Anti-Corruption Commission, not RCIPs. We find that sometimes there's an overlap there, but we tend to make those to the ACC, and then essentially we can liaise with them and say, we're disclosing it to you first. There's other parties we would consider disclosing this to SIBFI. But due to the sensitive nature of corruption offences, the ACC, all law enforcement, but in particular the ACC, likes to keep things as ring-fenced as possible to protect their investigations or potential investigations. So to name a few, so obviously that's on the law enforcement side. There's also Customs Border Control. If we might also disclose something to them. There could be someone potentially in a work permit who's engaging in criminal conduct, so we think that's something they may know. So sometimes it'll go to both RCIPs and CBC, and then they can liaise and see who's going to take the lead on it. And then on the AML supervisors is obviously SEMA. You got Department of Commerce and Investments for dealers of precious metals.
Okay.
Yep. The registrar is if it's an NPO matter. SEPA if it's an account, if we think that something relevant to accountants that they may supervise. And then I'm accustomed to saying CAR, but it's now the LSSA for attorneys.
So there's a fairly broad potential list of recipients of that information, but as you said, on a targeted basis to what's going to be relevant to that particular fact pattern that you've got.